She was murdered and dumped from a moving vehicle like she didn't matter. But she did, and she still does. Today we will be looking at the murder of Monica Reece. Who took her life? And will this question ever be answered? Before we move on, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share my channel. We're trying to grow this family here, so click the button down below. Monica was the 19-year-old daughter of Shirley Reece. She had a younger sister who had tragically died on January 8, 1993, when she was 12 years old. Now, her younger sister Sharon was diagnosed with stomach cancer when she was born, and her mother was told that she would not survive past the age of 12. And I believe it was because of this reason that their family was so close. So, mothers and daughters, like when the daughter is young, they're a mother-daughter relationship, but as the daughter gets older, they become more like friends. And this is exactly the kind of relationship that Monica and Shirley had. Now, according to Shirley, Monica was her best friend. They would do everything together. They would cook, they would wash, they would go shopping. They really did have a close relationship. In an interview, Shirley had stated that there was nothing about her daughter that she didn't miss. She missed everything about her daughter. And this is so sad because as women, one of our goals as we keep growing is to be able to provide for our mothers, because our mothers made so many sacrifices for us. So Monica was interested in the fashion world. She loved hairdressing, she loved designing. And according to Shirley, because of the drive and the motivation that Monica had, she knew that if she was alive today, she would have been involved in the fashion industry in some way or the other. So before her death, Monica had actually moved out of her mother's home and she was living with a female friend. Now, we don't know who this friend is, but the mother, Shirley, did not approve of this person. She did not like the idea of Monica even being friends with this girl. So she really didn't like the idea of Monica moving out to go and live with this girl. And she kept on Monica like, please, I don't want you involved with this woman. I don't like it. But Monica was an adult, so she really could not force her to come back home. But it was actually just a week prior to her death that Monica eventually decided, you know what, I'm gonna move back home. And she did tell her mother that she was gonna move back home, and her mother was so excited. But she told her, Monica, if you come back home, you cannot make the same mistake of moving out and going living with that girl. And Monica agreed. So, as time was coming closer, Shirley was getting more excited that her daughter was going to finally be coming back home. So it was all set. Monica was going to move back in just 1 week. But sadly, Shirley would not be able to have her daughter back home with her because it was before her moving back that she would tragically die. So at the time of her death, Monica was actually employed by the Loss Prevention Guard Service. Now on Good Friday, April the 9th, 1993, Monica left the place that she was staying, this house that she was sharing with a friend, and she went to work. So according to Shirley, she had no idea that Monica actually had to work because, Good Friday is a holiday, so a lot of people don't have to work, but apparently Monica did. So she thought that when Monica left the house, she was coming straight there. So whole day she was just sitting waiting for Monica to return home. And remember, in those days, they didn't have phones that they could pick up and call. So she couldn't just pick up and call and find out where Monica was. So on Good Friday, Monica was scheduled to work at the Ministry of Health on Brook Dam, and that's where she was working because according to her operations manager, David McKenzie, he actually went there at around 1 p.m. and he saw her working there. So it's confirmed she was at work at 1 p.m. So as I said, they did not have cell phones that they could pick up and call any and everybody if they needed to get in contact with them. So if somebody wanted to get in contact with you, they would need to call your workplace number. And according to David, Monica said that if a man by the name of Mark called for her to tell him to bring lunch to her work site. But when we hear about the information that David could give about Monica, it was clear that she looked up to him as not just her boss or her supervisor, but she also saw him as a friend. Because according to David, He said that Monica told him that she was actually dating somebody that had a 4x4 pickup. And in those days, to have a 4x4 pickup means, your money ton up. But she never told him what this person's name was, so he didn't have this information to relay to any of the investigators. And she also told him that she was actually in love with this man. So we really wish we knew who this man was, but we don't know his name. At some time, Monica had given David a piece of paper with a list of names and numbers, but the only name that stood out to him was Mark, and he could not remember what number was next to the name Mark. And then he actually misplaced the paper. People get your paper, you just easily misplace it. And I guess the reason why Mark stood out to him was because Mark was the name she told him to look out for if he called. So as people, that's the thing that people tell us to remember is what we actually remember. So after her shift, David dropped Monica on his bicycle at a phone booth at Regent and Hink Street, and this would be the last time that he would see her alive. Now, between 4:40 and 5 p.m., Monica told a security guard by the name of Mark Torrington that she was going on a date with a Chinese man. Who is this Chinese man? Is he Mark? We don't know. We just don't know. Now, the next thing that Monica said was pretty shocking, well, scarily shocking, given what would happen to her. She told Mark that if she ended up dead, not to be surprised. Now, she told him this after she told him that she was going on a date with this Chinese man. So, was she afraid of this man? Was he violent to her? Did she know something about him that she thought could cost her her life? But you remember, she never told anybody, at least she didn't tell Mark what this man's name was. Now, the next time she was seen was at around 6:30 p.m. and she was seen leaving Kylan Yard, and this was at lot 240 Camp Street. At this time, she had changed out of her uniform, and she was now wearing a white t-shirt and a black tights. Now, it was just 45 minutes later when she was seen entering the Brickdown police station by Special Constable Lyndon Samuels. And what was odd about her entering was that she was crying. So that's something that he noted, that she was crying while she was entering the police station. And then 5 minutes later, she was seen entering a black Pathfinder that was parked outside of the police station. Charles McAllister, a driver at a Church Street disco, stated that Monica had visited him at around 8:30 p.m. Then she left, she came back, then she left again. And when she left the second time, she went walking west along Church Street. This would be the last time that anyone could confirm to have seen her alive, because it would be an hour and a half later when Monica's body would be seen falling out of a moving vehicle at the front of courts. Back then it was known as Getty's Grant. Now remember, this was the day Monica was actually supposed to move back home. So Shirley was spending whole day just waiting for her daughter, waiting, but Monica was nowhere to be found. And it would be around 7 p.m. that Shirley would decide, you know what, let me go down to town and see if I find my daughter. And she went with her nephew. They went to Big Market to look for Monica, but Monica was nowhere. And you remember, they still can't pick up the phone. So she just decided, no, let's go back home. Monica will come home when she's ready to come home. Shirley remembered laying in her bed when she heard a knock on the door a little after 10. She opened the door and she saw some persons that were accompanied by police officers. No one would tell her anything. She kept asking, what's the matter? What's wrong? Why are you here? But no one would say anything. All they told her is that she needed to accompany them somewhere. No one told her anything. But she decided, okay, it's the police. I don't have a choice. Let me go with them. And it was until that they were turning onto Main Street when she saw a big crowd and she saw the white shoes that belonged to her daughter that she knew something was wrong. She asked if something happened to her daughter, but still, and this is so frustrating, but still no one would answer her. The moment she saw those shoes, she knew something was wrong with her daughter. And she just sat in that car frozen because she could not move. She was in such shock. The reason she knew those shoes belonged to her daughter was because she was the one that purchased them for Monica. And she could not bear to go and see her daughter laying on the floor covered in a white sheet. It was her cousin that accompanied her that actually went forward and positively identified the body as Monica Reece. One thing that I cannot understand about this case is that instead of telling her while she was at home, while she was in the comfort of her home, that her daughter was deceased, that her daughter was dead, they chose to take her to the site and thought that the best thing for her to do would be identify her daughter, and that would be the way she would find out that her daughter was dead. Now, you would think that having to bury her two daughters just 3 months apart would be the only thing that Shirley would have to endure, but this is not true. Shirley would have to be running behind the police up and down to try and get any information on the progress of the investigation. And anytime that she would remember something, she would go to the police to give information. But before she could even return home, she would get that threatening phone call. And this was something that continued to happen years after Monica's death. Shirley would continue to be threatened. Her life would continue to be threatened. Persons would tell her she would be next. If she even tried to find out what happened to her daughter, she would be next. And who could deal with this kind of thing? Like, who? You got, like, this is just so tragic. This woman's daughters are dead. Her last daughter tragically died. Her oldest daughter tragically died. And persons would think the best thing for them to do would be threaten this woman. She would even be walking the streets and people would stop to threaten her. Like, really yelling and nothing for do than to threaten a big woman who is mourning the loss of her two daughters. Really? But you have to ask yourself the question, what is it about Monica's death that would cause Shirley to be threatened this way just because she wants to find out what happened to her daughter? And why does it still remain unsolved? Now, according to witnesses that were there, Monica's body was thrown from a dark colored 4x4 pickup truck. Now, at the time that Monica's body was dumped, the famous race car driver Ray Rahaman was standing outside of Tower Hotel with his wife when he saw the entire thing. And he said that he tried to go behind the vehicle. Remember, that was a race car driver, he knows how to drive. But he was not able to catch up with the driver. When an autopsy was conducted, it was found that Monica was actually beaten to death. She had sustained a broken jaw along with additional injuries. And it was also found that she had sexual intercourse prior to her death. Pubic hairs and other samples were sent to be tested, but the results came back as inconclusive. And now detectives were no closer to solving her death. But were there suspects? In this case, there were actually 3 suspects. But after being questioned, they were released because it was found that they had plausible alibis. So, at the time, and even now, Monica's death is seen as a high society killing. And you're going to see why I say that when we talk about these suspects. Now, before we go on with these suspects, can you remember earlier on when I told you that Monica told Mark, the security guard, that she was going on a date with a Chinese man, and if she wound up dead, not to be surprised? Well, I don't know if it's the same person, but the report stated that there was a owner of a Chinese restaurant who were assisting police in the investigations. But he was found to have nothing to do with Monica's death, so that's all we know about that. There is nothing else. We don't know who this man is. We just don't know anything, okay? The first suspect was a 27-year-old man from a prominent family. He was arrested by police because his father owned a 4x4 pickup that was similar to the one that Monica's body was thrown from. His license plate number was also very similar to the one that an eyewitness had seen on the vehicle that Monica's body was dumped from. But he told detectives that even though, there is some similarity between his vehicle and the vehicle that was seen on the scene, it could never be his. Even though he did use his vehicle that night and his vehicle was similar to the one that Monica's body was seen to be dumped from, it is impossible that it could be him because he returned home at 7 p.m. with his girlfriend and he didn't leave his home until after 10 when he got a call from person saying, there's a vehicle that dumped a body that's very similar to yours, and that's when he left to actually go see what all the hullabaloo was about. So the detectives said that this was a plausible alibi and they let him go. And another reason why he was let go was because he said he didn't know Monica. I could say I don't know anybody, but anyways. He said he did not know Monica, and that was also another reason why he was let go. Now, the second suspect was also 27, and he was the son of a high-ranking government official. He also owned a 4x4 pickup, but he said that his vehicle was out of gas, so he couldn't use it that evening. And he actually used his motorcycle to go and visit a friend, and he left the friend at like 11:45, 10:45. And while he was on his way home and he was passing through town, that's when he saw Monica's body and he heard about what happened to her. When he was asked if he was acquainted with her, he said that he did not know who she was. The final suspect was arrested on April the 15th, 1993. He was also the son of a prominent businessman, and his family owned a 4x4 pickup very similar to the one that Monica's body was dumped from. Now, he claimed that on the night that Monica was murdered, he was at the home of an attorney from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. After leaving the attorney's home, he visited his girlfriend at around 10:30 before leaving and heading home. Now, he also denied knowing Monica, and he said that the only reason he found out about her death was actually from reading the newspapers the next day. Guys, I apologize about the lighting. It's really early in the morning, so the sun is now rising and the clouds are going until the sun is going in and out. I'm really sorry. So after all of these suspects were arrested, questioned, and then subsequently released, the case went cold. And there were so many rumors that surrounded the life and death of Monica. Shirley said that it was so sad to hear all of the rumors that persons were making up about her daughter. And she was asking people to just don't believe everything that they were hearing, that this was not Monica. One of the rumors that were going around was that Monica knew about a drug bust that was going to happen, and that was why she was killed. And that police were covering it up so that the person who was responsible did not suffer the consequences. And that the police knew who actually killed Monica. When interviewed, former Commissioner of Police Laurie Lewis was asked if there was any progression in the case of Monica Reece. He sucked his seat, very disrespectful, and then he said this, and I'm gonna read it word for word. "I wish we could just forget she and bury she. When you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And y'all want we for clean up the mess she left behind. One of these days, I can tell you something about Monica Reece that gonna shock you." My question is, if you knew so much about Monica, why is it that you cannot solve her murder? Anyways, he continues to tell the interviewer his theory of what he thinks happened to Monica the night that she died. He believed that Monica was having an affair with a married man or a man who had a woman, and the night of her death, she was in the vehicle with this man. They were having an argument because she was trying to pressure the man to leave his woman, and while they were having the argument, that's when she fell out of the vehicle, injured herself, and died from her injuries. But his theory was debunked because according to her autopsy, it was found that she was dead prior to being thrown out of the vehicle. So since 1993, there have been no further leads in who killed Monica. But in 2016, the Guyana Police Force Cold Crimes Unit decided to reopen Monica's case. But that was 5 years ago. And still there is no progress on solving her murder. Her mother, Shirley, remains hopeful that her killer will be brought to justice. April 9th of this year will mark 29 years since Monica was killed. Her killer continues to walk free. Whatever the reason was that led to her death does not matter. What does matter is that her killer is eventually brought to justice. A beautiful and happy person was tragically taken from her family. Monica Reece, gone but not forgotten.